everyone. Hello, Internet. I'm Associate Professor Martin Blamel. I'm the Associate Dean of Research at the UTS Faculty of Transdisciplinary Innovation. And the topic or talk presentation is about lifting the entrepreneurial ecosystems across Southern Sydney. And with me today are Mark Wigley, Senior Project Manager of Regional Development Australia Sydney, and Connor Keogh, a student from a subject 94663 at UTS, which we'll elaborate on in just a second. So a quick overview of the talk. One is a bit more detail on who we are, and then overview of the project. We'll spend a fair bit of time clarifying, demystifying some of the buzzwords, and possibly debunking some myths around entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial ecosystems. So there is a bit of a buzzword warning here, but we'll try and do our best to keep everything in as much plain speak as possible. And then really hand over to Connor to showcase a lot of the work that he's done as his team in this project as one of 10 teams, and leave some opportunity for you guys to ask some questions and leave you some provocations for the next steps ahead. So I'm Associate Professor Martin Blamel, Associate Dean Research. I've got kind of a few different hats, different mixed career, currently doing a lot of research around founders networks, accelerators, incubators, entrepreneurship education, research commercialization, and fell into studying entrepreneurial ecosystems for the last 3 or 4 years now, I guess. I've helped develop the incubator support program policy for the Department of Industry. And apologies in advance if the drilling gets any noisier. There's a unit being refurbished 3 stories above. Thankfully, the leaf blowers outside have stopped. I've been teaching entrepreneurship for 11 plus years formally, and probably longer than that. And I've also set up my own tech consulting company through which I helped nerds become entrepreneurs. That's me. Let me hand over to Mark and to Connor to give a quick introduction about themselves. And we'll do Mark in a second. And so a lot of this presentation will focus around the Southern Sydney area. So a lot of this actually kind of goes back to a roundtable held in February at the Georges River Council. That's Mark and actually one of our students that he hired as an intern helped pull together. With a lot of the people I guess you'd see in that screenshot, to really discuss and start a conversation around what entrepreneurial ecosystems are and what is the need for this southern area where 16% of the greater Sydney population is, and where there are thousands upon thousands of businesses, but yet a lot of the state infrastructure development is happening east-west rather than north-south where the population is. So that's kind of the greater agenda of these roundtables, is to elaborate and make a case for the economic development in a north-south axis rather than an east-west one. For this particular project, we had 10 teams covering the Bayside area, Canterbury, Bankstown, Georges River, Wollongong, and then teams for the RDA Illawarra area and also the RDA Sydney area. So let's find out a bit more about what is RDA. So Mark, over to you for a second.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So Regional Development Australia Sydney, I guess you could say we were the glue in this project. We helped to bring all the different entities together. Who are we? We're a not-for-profit association funded by the federal government. We've been around for quite a few years now. We're part of a network around Australia. So most regions of Australia have an RDA committee. Ours covers the Sydney region, and that involves 33 council areas from the Hawkesbury down to Sutherland and out to the Blue Mountains. We have a mantra. Our key objectives are around supporting jobs and economic growth across the Sydney region. We're 4 people. We're not big. There are a lot of big players in Sydney. And so what we tend to do is find our niches where we have strengths and where there's demand for the sorts of expertise that we can offer. Next, please, Martin. Thank you. In this context, our strength, we act like a concierge or a linkage service quite often. We've got good knowledge of, let's say, different ecosystems. Government, we're right across local government, good connections there, New South Wales government and Australian government. Private sector through different industry groups, through business chambers and through direct to actual businesses themselves. Also the not-for-profit sector, we've got connections there. Education, research. So we've got a fairly good overview of who's who and how to connect with those people. So as Martin said, the initial entry point for this Southern Sydney project was via an intern. We had a group of very dynamic people at Georges River Council that asked us to help them scope, believe it or not, co-working opportunities in Georges River. And we hired an intern who, from the Bachelor of Creative Intelligence and Innovation program at UTS, and he did an excellent job scoping that the feasibility of co-working in that area through face-to-face interviews and desktop research. The culmination of it, because the focus was co-working, but who uses co-working spaces? Small businesses, entrepreneurs, startups, and so on. So the culmination of this research was a round table on innovation and entrepreneurship. And we had some great speakers, not least of which was Martin here. We had ANSTO, we had Georges River Council themselves, and Sydney School of Entrepreneurship. And it was basically a discussion to engage key stakeholders, so we kept it small and focused, engage key stakeholders in future activities to develop entrepreneurship in the region. And out of that came agreement for this student entrepreneurial ecosystem mapping project. And it's also led to some other spin-offs. So we've done a bit of work with North Sydney Council around startup scoping. We're currently working with Ku-ring-gai Council on home-based businesses. And we did some work in Campbelltown with a Bachelor of Creative Intelligence and Innovation student on co-working feasibility down there. Thanks, Martin. Just briefly, you know, I'm not sure who's in the audience. I'm hoping there'll be some local government economic development people or people who've got an interest in that area. But what I've sensed from this project is that entrepreneurial ecosystem mapping has great benefits for local government. Firstly, it provides an overview of the local economy and the connectedness of the different entities. So it's not one thing here and another thing there, it's how they relate to each other. Secondly, it provides a framework for analysis of the local economy and gives economic development practitioners and decision makers an idea of how to support or resource initiatives that are going to make a real difference to the local economy. It also enhances engagement with other parts of the ecosystem. So it connects people to each other, and even outside the local area, it can lead to some valuable connections. And lastly, but definitely not least, is that it can help to promote or to profile a local economy. So it can be used as a glossy brochure in a way that gives people a sense of what's going on inside a particular area. I'll just say briefly how great it's been to work with UTS, and we don't have any expertise in this area. We're more, like I said, a glue, a linkage, and it's been great to learn from the experts.
Fantastic. Thanks for that intro, Mark. So on that note, we've just started a new project, again, with Georges River City Council, focusing on Cogra. And we're trying to do this, and I'll come to this at the very end too, that rather than a consultancy just doing this work for councils, we'd like to do this in a way that helps the councils actually learn how to continue doing this work themselves too. So there's a capability development element to how we engage with research partners and public government too. So that's a great overview about, I guess, the rationale for the project and the intentions and the goals and the aims of the project. And so this next bit is to really try and tease apart what the buzzwords, what the heck do we mean with entrepreneurship or even entrepreneur ecosystems? These definitions can be incredibly broad and incredibly flexible. And that means that you can't come up with a one-size-fits-all solution or method to studying them. So I guess the first bit is to appreciate the breadth of scope and definitions that fit within them, to then figure out how they would be applied to your particular context. And just a quick note, like this is part of this builds on a subject in the Diploma in Innovation, where we teach students various frameworks around innovation. And this subject in particular helps you understand, I guess, the landscape in which you want to be the innovator. In my prior experience, I've seen a lot of entrepreneurs kind of focus on iterating on their product or their service and almost lose a little bit of sight about the industrial context or the geographic context in which they're doing it. So this helps you have that close-up lens about what you're doing and the backup lens about the more holistic view about the context in which you're doing it. Entrepreneurial ecosystems. I don't know if you know the Kaufman Foundation. They're one of the largest philanthropic donations for entrepreneurship research. They've got a playbook in entrepreneurial ecosystems building. They've got a great soundbite that I've put up there saying ecosystem building is poised to become a mainstream approach to economic development, or it might just fizzle and fade away. So we're seeing report after report after report come out. There's a huge surge in interest in research and practice around ecosystems. But until recently, it's still been quite theoretical. And so what I'm trying to do with this project and a lot of this work here is to try and make it more concrete. But first, okay, so two things. What do we mean by entrepreneurship, and what do we mean by the system of entrepreneurship? So first, entrepreneurship can be, at the very, very micro level, can be seen as a set of capabilities. And you'll notice there's a lot of overlap between these, and this list of capabilities from the European Commission. There's a lot of overlap between them and, say, the future jobs reports from World Economic Forum and various other future employment jobs, which kind of reemphasizes the need to teach this at a very early level. There's a challenge with this. Like these skills, these capabilities should be relevant to pretty much anyone, right from kindergarten through grade 12 university all the way to seniorpreneurship, for the self-employed, people running SMEs, people employed directly by the entrepreneurs, people in the corporate environment doing entrepreneurship or sponsor entrepreneurs. So there's a challenge that if it's too broad, it becomes kind of all things to all people and kind of loses its materiality again. There's also a view that entrepreneurship could be a process, a stage where you've got kind of the idea, you're validating the idea, you register your ABN, now you've formulated the company, now you're testing with the company and working on job creation. It's still quite broad, but it hopefully gets people to realize, well, it's not just about high-tech startups. And we'll come to that in a second. There are various measures of entrepreneurship. Some of the government measures are typically around job creation or revenues. Patents is one too. Each of them has their quirks, their niches, and it kind of depends on what you want to do in your region. If you want like a high-tech entrepreneurship area or more of an SME sector, manufacturing sector. So it's a matter of picking and choosing the right metrics that fit with you. But noting that they're just indicators of what's actually happening. And this is where our method is to try and take a much more qualitative approach to really understand what's going on. So that's about entrepreneurship itself. We'll get to the ecosystem side in a second. And so this bit here pushes back a little bit on perhaps an overemphasis on high-tech startups. Yes, high-tech startups are important. I'm not debating that. But what I'm suggesting is that there are many other forms of entrepreneurship that are also important. So 50% of new jobs come from 6% of the firms. That 6% changes from time to time. In some areas, it's only 3% of the firms. They're known as the Vital Six. they're the high growth companies. But high growth doesn't necessarily mean high tech. So there are a couple different myths that we've seen in the research. So some of these high tech companies, they're not necessarily new. They can ticker along until they figure out what works for them before they take off. They're not necessarily high tech. Just look at the BRW or the AFR fast list. They're not all in that sector. Some people still believe they're based on research and university spin-offs. Some might be. Some might license the research, and figuring out who's licensing which research is really hard to assess. But usually, universities' role is much more in terms of the employment sector and producing the graduates who then jump into companies which then grow. Venture capital does play a role, but it's not the only means of growing companies. And companies don't necessarily grow in this nice organic, even geometric or exponential pathways. Sometimes they really take quantum leaps up and down. And those quantum leaps can be through mergers, acquisitions, strategic alliances, reverse takeovers, etc. And I think I've got a visual coming up that the unicorn phenomena is not explicit to or exclusive to any one area. It can be portable to other areas, but those regional differences still matter. It's not completely fully portable. So those are some of the buzzwords around entrepreneurship. For context, now a bit about entrepreneurial ecosystems. There are many theoretical models. I don't want to bore you with those. We'll focus on this one here, which is a synthesis of many other models. Basically says there are a couple of ingredients, which are the elements in the bottom box that make ecosystems happen. And ecosystems can have varying mixes of these ingredients. It's a bit like, a rainforest might be plentiful or bountiful in these ingredients, but another type of ecosystem, like a rural bushland, might be less munificent in those elements, but it still has them. And those elements tend to be the networks, leadership, finance, talent, knowledge. So the IP. Service providers play an important role, which are often overlooked. The policy frameworks, legal institutions, culture, all of these play different roles. And that plays out over time to create entrepreneurial activity, which is what we just discussed, that creates value, which then feeds back into the ecosystem. And so what we're trying to get at is really the causal relationships between these elements and those feedback loops. A little bit tiny here, but this is a visualization of how a micro ecosystem looks. If you look at an accelerator, it has a lot of the hallmarks of the ingredients of entrepreneurial ecosystems. It has the formal institutions, it has informal institutions, it's got the physical infrastructure, the market demand, it's got culture in it, networks, leadership, it's got all the right ingredients in there. And it's got all the hallmarks of the dynamics of ecosystems, of how systems work. They're not these magic black boxes that should never be unpacked because they're too complex. It's exactly this complexity that we're challenging. So let's elaborate a little bit on the complexity of ecosystems. Here's one definition that I like to pick on because it really draws out the complexity. And pardon me if it gets really technical, but I'll unpack these terms in each of these terms in a moment. So an entrepreneurial ecosystem it's self-organized, it's adaptive, it's geographically bounded, or at least it can be. It's a community of complex agents. Agents is another term for basically people or organizations operating at multiple aggregated levels. And they're non-linear interactions that result in the activities through which ventures form, dissolve, and value is created. So in comparison to, say, cluster research or network research, entrepreneurial ecosystem really tries to look at the causal relationships and the dynamics of a place, rather than just the co-location and agglomeration of it. So that makes it more challenging to study, but in my view, also more interesting. So here's some organizing principles. So because they're so organic and emergent, there's no central controller. Like, policy does matter, but there's no central controller, conductor, director who tells the ecosystem what to do. It's much more people from the system coming together, jamming together, and it's a collective where everyone's voice is appreciated, comes together to form what's happening in the system. Nor are they like Ford Motors back in the days, a closed system where there's an input somewhere. Once you're in, and then you should operate within the system, and then somewhere at the back, something comes out and gets fed into the market. They're much more diffuse and more organic. So this also means from a complex systems perspective, that the system is situated and networked to the system around it, but the system itself consists of subsystems, which are networked amongst each other. So it's nested, and the subsystems are networked amongst each other too. Something I saw firsthand when I was an entrepreneur too, and likely many people in the audience see, is that if you reach into your wallet, pull out your business cards, you probably don't just have one. You're wearing multiple hats and have multiple roles, and that's actually quite common in a lot of systems. People have, either through their career paths or their part-time jobs, or who knows how, have those multiple hats, and because of that, multiple networks and multiple roles, which again introduces complexity as about who plays which role. I love picking on these diagrams. I mean, the simplifications of these diagrams really matters. It really helps clarify, give people a place in the process of where they are. But so they're kind of an artificial linear typology of where your company is. Are you just at the ideation stage, the validation stage, early traction, high growth, etc. But the world isn't that linear. The ecosystems tend to focus on much more circular, cyclical, iterative process where there can be major setbacks. This one's a funny one. So ecosystems do have norms, formal ones and informal ones, but they're adaptive too. So both of this applies. So they have rules, but people can't. Those rules can be changed. And one that I don't want to elaborate too much on is the butterfly effects, where there's can be something that happens way back in the past that can have major follow-on implications much later. The reason I don't like this rule too much is because it can go both ways. You could say, well, if anything can happen leading to anything, then this rule becomes kind of pointless. But there are some fun examples where Silicon Valley's arguably triggered because of Fairchild Semiconductors. Research in Motion made the latest version of the Waterloo ecosystem happen. Nortel, Mitel, CorelDRAW kind of helped start the Ottawa innovation system from which now Shopify has popped out of. And so these systems can have those nonlinear effects, and they can be place-based, and what happens can take a long time to play out. So if you're familiar with Brad Feld's work, he's also fully in tune with this too, that it can take 10 years. So you need to be patient in terms of what stepping stones you're putting in place now actually play out in the future. And so as a result of this, ecosystems they bubble up, they emerge. They're not controlled. They're at best shaped. Design is almost too much of a controlling word. They really just emerge as a combination of everyone in the system and their actions, whether those actions are deliberate or whether they're accidental or coincidental. And hopefully, and this is where policymakers and these roundtables and conferences like this can come in, is where you get that common language and elaborate on what the coherent set of values are that then guide your actions, so that you are playing a little bit more like jamming together to the same song, rather than playing totally different instruments at different rhythms, different tones. And then coming back to the nestedness, ecosystems, yes, they work within a region, but you still need to recognize how they connect to the external environment. So quick takeaway for any policymakers in the audience, or even incubators or accelerators who are looking kind of at the micro policy of like a miniature ecosystem, is to share the system with others, and don't be too controlling. To define, clear boundaries, who's in, who's out, but so that you don't end up studying the whole world and considering everybody to be part of the ecosystem, because that would just do your head in. But then once you've figured out, okay, this is what I'm going to study, this sector, this geography, this demographic, etc. Once you've got those boundaries set, then be very inclusive of who's in the ecosystem. That kind of comes back to that first point too. And don't expect linear growth. It's great when things kind of slowly evolve and move along, but also look for those opportunities where there are these huge step changes. And unfortunately, some of those step changes can be also steps back. But I guess one of the biggest challenges is to have some norms and values that guide all of this, and to be patient in developing them, but also to be proactive in developing them. So some quick points about them coming back to measurement of ecosystems. Some of you are probably familiar with the Crossroads report, the Startup Muster report, Startup Blink, etc. They're okay. I mean, they elaborate and they provide you year after year after year some idea of how well you're doing. My grief with them is they don't provide any sense of the causality, and their data is much too general, or it's much too broad in terms of the geography that they encompass. It's really hard to come up with actionable, I guess, interventions that make the ecosystem tick. We spent a couple months picking apart these reports to look at the data upon which they're built and comparing to the ecosystem frameworks, and pretty much all the data is usually at the national level, maybe at the state level. It's really hard to get that fine-grained data of how does your particular ecosystem actually click, what makes it tick. And then there's also the currency that there's this pipe dream that you might have real-time data of your ecosystem. The question is, what would you do with that real-time data? You're not going to do policy changes overnight and change them again and change them again. So the data that's out of date isn't useful. Real-time data isn't necessarily useful either. But finding that mid-range is kind of the sweet spot. And the data is also not very causal. So in terms of the methods, what we're trying to do is acknowledge these quantitative methods that are usually quite aggregated and larger scale, but really trying to unpack the interconnected, unpack who's in the system and how they're interconnected, and how do those relationships actually make the system tick. And to do that, the first step is to just define and visualize what the ecosystem is. There's a really good method here by GIZ, which the ASPNDE, Aspen Network for, I think, Development of Economics, something like that. Email me about it. They put together a really useful proposal on how to visualize ecosystems. That came out while we were already doing ours, and it was great to see that the methods more or less align. And Connor will talk you through the steps of going through the assessment of that. And then there are funny methods like MIT REAP, where they actually pull on a lot of the aggregated metrics at the state level, but then they also do the qualitative bit of bringing people together at the roundtable to help qualitatively see the ecosystems emerge. What I find is they're often missing the bit that connects the dots between what's happening at the individual level through to the community level that then gets reflected in the national level, or the regional level. Right. Deep breath. Hopefully that clarifies all the buzzwords and jargon for some of them. I'm always happy to share the slides later. So let's hear from Connor about about the project itself. So this is, I guess, my last slide before I hand over to Connor. This subject is 9463. It's an undergraduate subject, navigating entrepreneurial ecosystems and initiating change. We piloted it 3 times with the Sydney School of Entrepreneurship. I was known as the navigator there. We've been teaching, I think, 5 times now at UTS. And it used to include a lot of local tours with Sydney Startup Hub, Fish Stone and Chalk, and be very urban and startup centric. And this is the first time we've taken a larger, broader view of what is entrepreneurship and how broad can these ecosystems go. The general process is to map out an ecosystem, identify its strengths, usually historically determined, identify the gaps, and propose points of leverage in the system and ways to advance the system further. And handing over to you, Connor, and just let me know when to advance the slides.
All right, so if you just want to jump on to the next slide, Martin.
Sure.
Welcome all. As Martin introduced earlier, my name is Connor, and I was a student in this subject a few months ago. I'm going to take you through a few of the key details from the reporting that we completed during this 3-week period. So the Georges River Council wanted to promote job growth that was authentic to and provided the opportunity for community involvement. One of the key areas they wanted to look towards was empowering the creative industries. So let's just start off with some basic stats that are going to help to define the ecosystem. So the Georges River District is an area with abundant opportunity for small businesses to grow. To start. However, trends were recognised that businesses move towards more developed areas once they've started to grow a little bit more. The population has been growing steadily, of around 1,500 people per year. Statistics can also indicate the trend of growth within the jobs in the various sectors. So conclusions can be drawn from that. The graph that you can see on this screen is the change between 2011 and 2016. You can see that the healthcare sector had grown by about 1,500 workers. This was due to quite a lot of different projects that went on in that time, which I'll go into in a bit. Accommodation and food services grew quite a fair bit as well. And then another one that grew was the construction quite considerably. Those top three sectors had grown more than every other sector combined. Closely following that was the professional, scientific and technical services sector, totaling a growth of 770 during this time period. The professional, scientific and technical services includes quite a wide range, from engineering and IT services to lawyers and accountants. This is the sector that we identified to have lots of potential for growth, and also links closest to those creative industries that Georges River Council wishes to be empowered. On to the next slide. So we did quite an extensive analysis towards the existing projects, so projects that were past, present and future. Through doing this, we were able to provide a bit of an insight to the nature of the growth in the area. The first one that you can see on the bottom left of the screen is the St. George Hospital upgrades. So $277 million was spent to provide new infrastructure for the area. This building contained new operating theatres and patient beds. Hundreds of new jobs were able to come from this particular project. The next one that I'll mention quickly is the Hurstville Plaza project, which was aimed to provide the shaded public seating, outdoor dining, and provide an area for community to meet and work outdoors. This could see further use from the new work from home trend, as people are starting to work away from the offices. You might be able to see more people meeting up there for informal business meetings to have a bit of change of scenery from the Microsoft Teams calls or the Zoom calls. The last key one that I'll mention is the planned Kogarah to Parramatta rail link. The interesting part of this analysis is a sort of three cities concept. An idea that New South Wales is going to have three major cities, one being the Eastern Harbour City, the Central River City and the Western Parkland City. This planned project is a way to sort of link Kogarah up to each of those key cities. Moving on to the next slide. This one is a depiction of the current ecosystem and where it stands. Note that there is quite a lot of fragmentation between the key stakeholders. You do see connections with many education institutions to the City Council. An example of this could be the collaboration through development of the chill-out hubs, which were in the previous slide. However, there's not a huge range of interaction between other parts of the ecosystem. If we were to build a stronger ecosystem, there would need to be a huge connection built up between each of the stakeholders. The Georges River District has a very strong capability for becoming a key hotspot for these services. This next slide that I go into is a potential ecosystem that we've designed. So we proposed the implementation of a hub, so a space that professional services can work together in one key facility. This facility might have a floor of engineers, a floor of architects, and like all the other professional services joined into one. They could also service quite a lot of things within that and include different facilities that smaller companies may not be able to afford. Examples of this might include 3D printers for a few technical services. Education precincts could also collaborate with these businesses. This could be through internships or possibly just through learning opportunities. This also gives the individuals that go through these programs more of a connection to the businesses local to them. This is a very key thing that we think is going to help to allow the area to grow. The next slide is one where we've just indicated some of the existing businesses in the area and where they're going to fit into this said ecosystem. So that's just a quick one. Moving on to the next one. During this time, we were able to also create a value proposition, which outlines the key advances that this project can assist in. Some of the examples that I'll comment on is providing a link between businesses, education providers, and the council, connecting businesses to future employees, and students to internship and mentorship programs. Council-run events and workshops to support individuals, and reducing the R&D costs and aiding cross-collaboration. The last slide that I'll quickly run through is just about the leverage proposal. So the goals of where we wanted to be within the period of time. So the first step that we wanted to look towards was establishing the hub, building the relationships and promoting and creating awareness. This is one that we envisioned would take about 3 years to work with. Moving on from that, we'd hope to get some of the companies involved to start running extra programs and to help to empower the individuals within that area to be able to learn new things. So that's then Horizon 2. Following from that, we're hoping this sort of idea can be a bit more internationally recognized and is one that could follow through in other areas. So that's just a bit of a brief for some of the work that we did over this period of time in the course. And I'll hand back over to Martin. Thank you. And Martin, you're on mute.
Cool. Thanks for the heads up. Sorry, I muted it because of the drilling in the background again. Awesome. Thank you so much, Connor. So this is Connor was one of 10 teams there. Each of them had their own visualization, their own analysis of what the assets in the ecosystem were and how they're connected, what the proposals are going forward. And I gotta say, even teams that had very similar briefs came up with different solutions and different interpretations that were going forward. One funny thing that, and great to see some of the questions pop into the Q&A. So we are reading that. I'll try and address those live. Let's see where we are. So there's a few next steps, and then I'll highlight these, and then we can go back and answer some of the Q&A. So some things to think about is where are the borders of the ecosystem. So with Connor's example, is clearly the geography of the Georges River Council. In previous versions of subject, we've also said, okay, let the students define what ecosystem boundaries they're interested in, whether it's the Australia-wide space tech industry or the CBD fintech industry. Specifying those boundaries is quite relevant to figure out what you want to do in this system. As a policymaker, you might be the most practical solution would be the geographic or the political boundaries. If you're in clean tech, you might say, okay, I'm kind of agnostic in an industry focused. Say you're a community manager, you might be agnostic to the geographic boundaries and more interested in the sectoral boundaries. And this kind of comes back to who do you define who's in and who's out, how early stage to go. There was, interestingly, and I'm a little biased here as somebody in the university, a lot of emphasis on training people about the value of entrepreneurship, the value of thinking in terms of complex systems and creating value, not just taking up that job. So a fair few of the teams had that recommendation of building these hubs where people can connect with each other, and working together to share that knowledge, and also facilitated workshops and educational programs. And on the last bit there at the bottom, how accurate is your information? That's a fun one. If you look at something called Cunningham's Law, these visuals provide a really good fodder for putting them in front of people to instantly get a reaction for them to say, that's wrong, that's complete bollocks what you've presented me. And it gets under their skin for them to elaborate, oh, actually, this is what I think the ecosystem is. And it gets them into explaining what the ecosystem is. So as you map out the ecosystem and show people these visuals, it really, I guess, engages a lot of stakeholders for them to think through where they want to be in the ecosystem and whether your representation is accurate and how to evolve it, and creates that awareness that there is a system in the first place. If some of you remember the start rail maps that Blue Chili was producing, they're a great visualization where the moment they printed it and produced and said, here it is, everyone, they got tons of feedback to constantly evolve it and evolve it and evolve it. And quite often they're just an amazing discussion starter. You don't want to go too overboard and have too much detail in them, because at that point you've lost track of the purpose of getting people together. And that sort of gets into Wilma's first question here, is like, once you have the data of how your ecosystem looks, how do you increase the amount of entrepreneurial actions within a council or region? I guess in this exercise, what we've done is a very sequential approach, where you talk to one stakeholder, then another one, talk to another one, and each time you're talking to them, you're getting them to explain their particular view of the ecosystem, their particular view of the history of the ecosystem, and perhaps their vision of where it should be going, and looking at their connections. But you're having those conversations very, very sequentially. But you can at least accumulate those conversations and those insights to develop this map. And once you've got that in place, it's easier to go back to them and to their contacts and say, okay, look, everyone, here's our latest assessment. It's still just a draft. It's always going to be a draft because it evolves, of what the ecosystem is. Now let's come together in groups to decide what we can do about it. What do we want to do about it? How are there just distinct initiatives that can be done? How do we pilot them? How do we prioritize them? So quite often, it's like there's a natural gravitation to say, we need a hub, we need a co-working space, we need to build something. A lot of that, putting the I guess the lean startup hat on, you can pilot that. You can look for the existing spaces that can then be repurposed, like libraries, and just use those to test these conversations, test the workshops, test the maker spaces, to then figure out what the next steps forward are. So I hope, Wilma, that's answered your question. Let me go through one more thing. And I've got a last line of final thoughts, and then I'll look at the next question here from Wilma. But by all means, chime in. It's unfortunate we can't see your faces and hear your voices as you've got questions. But here's a fun one that reminds me of the analysis we did on Sydney's Tech Startup Action Plan. Is sadly and this is particular for the policymakers in the audience, sadly there's a bit of a disconnect historically between research and academia and policy, that we don't necessarily speak the same language. A lot of the research on innovation policy isn't translated in a way that policymakers can understand. Policymakers don't have access to those articles and aren't necessarily PhD qualified to understand the academic jargon that they're loaded with. So what we're trying to do with a project like this is to do it in a very pragmatic, practical way that anyone can understand what the system is, and in a way that can be communicated where the points of leverage are and what can be done about it, in a way that we can still do the research side of things, but it still has the immediate translation to what's in the system, and to pinpoint in a very crisp way of where the points of intervention might be. Because policy isn't necessarily, it might be evidence-based, but the ministers and the people making the decision on the policy don't necessarily have the time of day to unpack the nuances of every individual study. And for the entrepreneurs in the audience who would like to see more evidence-based policy, that's one explanation why sometimes it works, but often, unfortunately, that's not always the case. So some final thoughts about the role of universities, and hopefully this gets a little bit to the next one, is the role of universities is, yes, we're here to help. We've got researchers who are happy to look at things rigorously and critically. So we won't necessarily produce what you want to see. So if you want a glossy graphic that will, show your region in the most favorable light possible, that may or may not be true. It'll be a realistic and critical view of where the ecosystem is at. And we'll, of course, work with you to say, what can we do about it? Because as researchers, we're interested in why and how. Like, how do we change systems, and why do they change? Why do they adapt and react the way they are, the way they do? And we'd also like to do this in the way that helps you continue being able to do this yourself. And of course, like Connor and the intern that helped kick this off back in February, universities are an amazing source of graduates and talent. So by all means, reach out if any of this appeals to you. I'm open for comments for Mark and Connor while I read through Wilma's comment here for a second. So Wilma's follow-on question was, once universities and councils are speaking, what can they do together outside of placements for students to get more entrepreneurial activity in the region or council? lots to. This is something that is part of a larger discussion. It depends on what the individual region is, what the needs are. I mean, for starters, in the Bayside area, we've got the UTS Tech Lab. They would love to know what the needs of the individual businesses are to help them, particularly in the advanced manufacturing space. So there are many ways. I mean, there can be a direct linkage between the university and the businesses in that council area or with the council. But I hate to say it, like almost the sky's the limit. But this would come out through roundtables and workshops about what can we do, and then figure out what should we do. What's the highest priority? I guess also, like, circling back to what can we do, what can we test in a quick way without having to overinvest and overextend ourselves. You wouldn't want to overnight commit to a 12-story building without having the proper business case for it, but at least you can test what are some of the interactions that might happen inside a proposed hub, and can you pilot those interactions. Cool. Mark or Connor, do you want to add any further insights?
Maybe just from my side, I think what can universities and councils do? I mean, it doesn't have to be councils. We've also had broader regional groups. We've had them engaged in discussions. So it can be, it can be any entity really. I think the beauty of it is that the universities can provide the academic background and maybe presented in a slightly complicated way. But then, as Martin said, once you have a discussion with the stakeholders on the ground, you can work out pragmatic steps that can be taken to support the ecosystem.
There's an interesting question from Manjula. Are there any insights on whether winners or innovators are working with traditional businesses, perhaps less innovative, should be a priority? It's almost an age-old policy question of, if you want jobs, you can create construction sites, which create a lot of jobs, but those aren't necessarily the high-value, knowledge-based economy type jobs that really move Australia up the OECD rankings. So it depends on what your horizon is, whether you're looking for short-term gains or longer-term gains. There's definitely a significant case to be made to focus on the winners and the high-growth companies. I forget which one it was. A Campaign Monitor that was in the area, that was a high growth company. That's the council really wanted to show that, look, this can happen, and we want to inspire more companies to be like them. So there's certainly a case to be made to inspire people to really think big and swing at the fences and do something amazing, in the hopes that that is this high growth, has a high growth effect on the economy, is so that they're one of the 5% that create 90% of the new jobs. But by and large, like, every business can benefit from thinking more innovatively, even incrementally more innovatively. So it kind of depends on what the agenda is for any given economy, or for any given, or what the strategy is for your local region. I imagine the economic development policy or strategy for a town like Barrie would be different to downtown CBD. All right, we've got 1 minute and 40 left. Connor, any other insights, or Mark, any concluding comments or insights?
Can I just say that, from a Regional Development Australia perspective, we'd be quite happy to make connections, as we do, but also maybe to host a more specific event that maybe looks at some particular case studies and what might be possible at a council level. So we'd be quite happy to make those connections.
And personally, what I would love to see is some of these initiatives actually tested and piloted, and to see some of the outcomes, long-term effects. I mean, I'd love to, for our students, for RDA, for all of us to just get in there, do things, and see how it works. So these reports and presentations are important, but I'd love to see follow-on actions on them that are based on that collective discussion. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for the kudos and the Q&A and chat. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Connor, for joining us.
Thank you.
And
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, guys.
Email us anytime.